Not everyone gets to make their MMA debut under perfect circumstances, and sometimes you just have to take that short notice opportunity just to get your foot in the door. And honestly, it's not that uncommon to be seriously outmatched in your UFC debut. But in some very rare cases, MMA promotions have called upon guys to fill in where they've had no hope of winning and were just being brought in as another body. And then they ended up becoming some of our favourite fighters to watch. I'm Bailey, and from MMA On Point, a shout out really quickly to all of our channel Hall of Famers. Thank you for all the support, and these are 10 MMA fall guys who became fan favourites. Quick disclaimer as well, there's no one in this list like Lando Venata or Sean Strickland. Yes, they made their debuts on short notice against really tough guys, but they were also undefeated and on win streaks. UFC were probably going to sign them anyway. This list is about guys who were literally brought in to essentially only help their competition get a win, or fighters the promotions just didn't even care about. Number 10, Patrick Cote. In the early 2000s, Tito Ortiz was kind of the man in the UFC. He defended his light heavyweight championship 5 times and became the face of the promotion. Eventually, he lost to Randy and in the long-awaited matchup with Chuck, but that didn't mean he wasn't still basically the top contender outside of those two, or that he wasn't a superstar as far as the promotion were concerned at the time. At UFC 50, Tito was supposed to have a bounce-back performance against Guy Mezger, who was a recognizable name and was also definitely a veteran at that point in his career, but when he pulled out due to a stroke-like symptom just 4 days before the event, the unknown Canadian Patrick Cote was called to step in. He was a champion in Canada at the time, but he only had 5 wins on his record, and he was up against a guy who had that many title defenses of the World Championship. As far as world MMA fandom went, he was essentially a nobody. But he stuck it out with Tito for 3 rounds and impressed the UFC with his ability to basically not get knocked out or submitted, something Tito had been doing to pretty much everyone. But even then, they only signed him for 1 fight. That's how much they actually cared about getting Cote in the UFC. He went back to Canada to defend his title and ended up getting 2 more shots in the UFC afterwards, but he lost both of those. Still, after that, even with 3 losses, it was enough to get him on the comeback season of The Ultimate Fighter. And then his subsequent 5-fight win streak after that with 2 knockouts of the night made him pretty much a fan favourite. Number 9, Darren Elkins. Well, it might seem at first glance that the guy who calls himself the damaged Darren Elkins has made a career out of being beaten up and surviving in cage fights, but actually no, who am I kidding, that is basically what he's known for. But he's come back from the brink of defeat many times, and that's what's made him such a fan favourite. But his UFC debut was no different, as he once again found himself in what seemed to be a pretty impossible situation. Future Team Alpha Male striking coach and longtime MMA vet Dwayne Ludwig competed all over the world throughout his career, and he picked up some high-level wins along the way, beating Jens Pulver for the UCC lightweight title, beating Genki Sudo in the UFC, and also setting the record for the fastest KO ever in the promotion. But after heading to Strikeforce for a while, and 4 years after the fastest KO, he was back in the UFC where they were hoping he could recreate the same magic. He got Jim Miller in his first fight and was armbarred in round 1. But no matter, Dwayne still had that star potential and of course the ability to knock people unconscious. The UFC were heading to Broomfield, Colorado, and they wanted to give him a nice matchup in front of his home crowd. Now, he was supposed to fight Spencer Fisher, but he pulled out with an injury, and that's when the unknown Darren Elkins stepped in to make his UFC debut. No one really knew anything about Darren other than it was a tough ask to step in against one of the most feared strikers in the division. He was also going up a weight class. But Darren took him down in just 40 seconds and broke his ankle when he did it.
Oh, you see, give out. Oh!
However it was going to end, no one expected that, and Darren pulled off a massive upset. Anyway, he dropped to 145 after that, and over the years has become a UFC staple and a fan favourite. Number 8, Brandon Moreno. The former 125-pound champion has had one of the most interesting and crazy UFC careers ever. He joined the World Fighting Federation in 2014 and went 5-0 in the promotion, winning their title in the process, and that got him a ticket into the Ultimate Fighter Tournament of Champions, where the UFC pulled in all the flyweight champions from other promotions. They competed in a tournament, and the winner was going to fight Demetrius Johnson for his UFC belt. Now, this was kind of still early in Brandon's career. He was the bottom-seeded fighter, so he fought Alejandro Pantoja 7 years before their eventual title fight, and Moreno was choked out in the second round. But oddly enough, before the show had finished airing, Brandon actually made his UFC debut. Now, not only has that never happened before, but he was also being asked to fill in short notice against the number 9 guy in the division, Luis Smolka, a guy who had one of the longest active win streaks, submission attempts, and strike rates in the whole division. Let's be honest here, Brandon was already out of the show. He had come from another promotion. The UFC didn't really care if he win or lost. He didn't even make it through the tournament. He probably wasn't going to get to fight on the finale as he got finished. Throwing him in there to cover on short notice, it didn't didn't really mean anything. But Brandon surprised everyone when he actually beat the top 10 contender Smolka, submitting him in the first round. It was a classic underdog story, and the popularity of the babyfaced assassin only grew from there. He also got cut in 2019 when changes were being made to the flyweight roster, but he won the belt in LFA and then filled in on short notice again, this time against the number 2 contender Askar Askarov, and took the undefeated fighter to a draw for the first time in his career. Number 7, Joe Lauzon. I think most MMA fans, even the newer ones, will recognise Joe Lauzon. He's known for stacking an absolutely absurd amount of performance bonuses, and while putting on Fight of the Night and submitting half of the UFC lightweight roster, he pretty quickly became a fan favourite. I mean, no shit. But he was brought into the promotion as just another guy for someone to beat. Back at UFC 63, they had just reinstated the lightweight division for the first time in a few years, and they were also bringing back the first ever lightweight champion, Jens Pulver, a legend and someone who might fight for the belt again. It was Jens' first fight back in the UFC in 4 years, and they wanted to find him an opponent that could get him back on the winning track. At least that's what Joe Lauzon told the PKA podcast back in the day, that he was there to hype Jens' comeback. That's not actually what happened at all though. Joe came out in the first round and knocked him out. It turned out not to be an easy fight for Jens Pulver, and Joe was given a spot on The Ultimate Fighter after that.
I fought Jens Pulver in my first fight in the UFC. It was a good opportunity that I didn't want to pass up, and I knocked him out. And then afterwards, a couple months later, I went into the Ultimate Fighter house, and Jens was a coach and BJ was a coach.
He went from a guy that the UFC hoped would boost Jens Pulver to one of the most exciting and fan favourite fighters in the division. Number 6, Crazy Horse. You're going to be pretty hard pressed to find an MMA career that's covered in more inconsistencies, felony arrests and crazy upsets than Charles Crazy Horse Bennett's. His record as of today is 30, 45 and 2, but he's managed to gain himself a cult following inside MMA because of the legendary stories and mythical moments he's been involved in over the years. But he, of course, didn't start out as a fan favourite. He needed a platform to make himself known to the world, and although he had been fighting on the regional scene in the US, he didn't really have anything going for him as a 12-5 pro when Japan picked up the phone and called him over to fight in Pride. His opponent, only their new lightweight star and knockout artist Takanori Gomi, who'd only lost to Joaquim Hansen for the Shuto title and to BJ Penn in Hawaii. Gomi was a future star, was undefeated in Pride, and also happened to be the future champ, and the Japanese promoters undoubtedly just wanted to give him another easy win in what would be a bit of a spectacle. But from the moment they got Charles on camera, he was already a fan favourite. He even said Gomi means trash in Japanese, and he was here to take the trash out. Unfortunately, he got Kimura'd in 5 minutes, but he made it an entertaining fight from the get-go. I mean, the guy sat on the top rope as soon as the bell went. But after that, they kept bringing him back, and everything from his personality on the microphone to the crazy shit he did in the cage helped turn him into a fan favourite. Number 5, Kevin Holland. Some of you might remember the time Kevin Holland was on the Contender Series. He fought for a place in the UFC in front of Dana White, and despite winning, he wasn't given a contract. Why? Well, because Dana thought he talked too much, basically. He just didn't like him. And to be fair, they also had Chris Curtis, Alonzo Menefield, and Greg Hardy on that episode, so it's not like Dana was spoiled for choice. But when one of the scariest middleweights in the division, Thiago Santos' opponent, fell out, the UFC needed a replacement on short notice, and Kevin Holland stepped in to take on the mythical fighter. Most people on the roster didn't really want to fight this guy, let alone make a debut in the UFC up against him, and Dana had already shown he didn't really care for Kevin, win or lose.
For those of you that don't know the story, he was on the Contender Series, but he wouldn't shut up. The entire fight he was talking to me. I don't want him, I'm not interested in him.
He also spent the whole time talking to him in that one as well, running his mouth while putting on an entertaining fight, definitely giving fans their money's worth. This was enough to make Dana completely change his mind, and he kept him around where Kevin's style and attitude has gained him a lot of fans. Number 4, Soju. Before MMA fans were super educated on what fighting was actually all about, it was, in a bit of a way, all about optics. I mean, that's why UFC 1 was so crazy. The smallest guy was tapping out all the big dudes. It didn't seem possible, but that was the beauty of mixed martial arts. The Cameroonian-born self-named African assassin Soju had won some national judo championships back at home, but when he transitioned into MMA, he was far from a well-rounded fighter. After 2 quick wins on the regional scene, he met Glover Teixeira in the WEC, and he was KO'd in just under 2 minutes. Still, I think someone in Japan had seen that fight and jumped at the opportunity to get a guy that looked physically incredible and intimidating, but perhaps couldn't fight as well as he looked, over to Japan to help boost some of their fighting talent. So the matchmakers put him up against Little Nog, brother to the former champion and who himself was a big star and on a comeback after losing to Shogun in the 2005 Grand Prix. He bounced back with a win over Alistair, giving him a guy who's only had 3 fights but looks insane with his shirt off. That's a great idea to help him on the road to recovery. Soju came in as a plus 1200 underdog and then smoked Little Nog in just 23 seconds. The crowd went crazy. The African assassin became a superstar overnight when all he was supposed to be was a scary guy Pride could use to push their fighters. He also then repeated this performance by knocking out Ricardo Arona in just 2 minutes, but then it was off to the UFC and top-level talent where unfortunately Sokou just didn't have the experience. But those two performances alone have made him an endearing fan favourite. Number 3, Mark Hunt. If you're not a fan of the Super Samoan K1 kickboxing legend, then I just don't think we can be friends. Mark Hunt became a fan favourite in Pride amongst those US fans that were watching the Japanese show. Notably, in his first 4 MMA fights, he took both Mirko Cro Cop and Vanderlei Silva to a split decision, which was crazy for a guy with 0 MMA experience. But by 2006, Hunt started losing, and at the time UFC purchased the Japanese organisation, Mark Hunt was just 5-6 as a pro. Now, those aforementioned Mark Hunt fans will already know that when the UFC bought Pride and a few of those fighters' contracts, they didn't want Mark. Dana himself offered to buy Hunt out of his contract because he was a losing fighter. He had no ground game. He just didn't think Mark would even survive in the UFC. But the Super Samoan refused, asked to fight anyway, and then lost his debut in just 60 seconds by another submission. Things basically couldn't have been any worse, and if he wasn't a fall guy, then he certainly was now. They put him in there with Chris Teixeira, a wrestler who would no doubt wipe Mark Hunt off the UFC roster, but the K1 legend showed everyone why he belonged in the big show, getting a knockout of the night and becoming an instant fan favourite to the uninitiated for many years to come. Number 2, Yoshihiro Takahashi. There were a lot of pro wrestlers from Japan that decided to get involved in MMA when it first started. It was kind of the same, I guess, in some ways. I mean, it was in a ring, but most of the wrestlers found out pretty quick that some of these fights were real fights, not works, and, well, most didn't stick around too long or actually trained hard enough and became mixed martial artists themselves. But for a big 6'7" guy like Yoshihiro Takahashi, he didn't really take this approach. His size meant he was an instant attraction to the Japanese fans, but because he didn't really have any training at all, he was basically always going to lose. He started out as a rugby player, then a kendoka and a lifeguard before getting into pro wrestling in Japan. He was trained by the legendary Takada and won a lot of titles in wrestling, but in 2001 became a free agent and, inspired by many of his teammates, decided to try his hand at MMA. Pride brought him in and matched him up with the 6-1 Fujita, a fan favourite in his own right, whose only loss had been to the former UFC champion Mark Coleman. Yoshihiro had nothing going for him apart from his size and toughness, and he got absolutely battered and submitted in the second round. That didn't stop them from putting him in there with Semi Schilt, a kickboxing world champion, and then Dom Fry, a guy on a 9-fight win streak who was 14-1. Takahashi had no business being in there. It was a spectacle for Pride. His fight with the Don won Fight of the Year in 2002, and although he was always a fall guy, he was most definitely a fan favourite at the same time. Number 1, Minowa Man. If you've seen any of the Pride Fighting Championships, chances are you've seen or have at least heard of the guy who became known as Minowa Man. Ikuhisa Minowa was a pro wrestler and pankration fighter, and apart from being a black belt in judo, didn't necessarily have anything that made him that particularly unique or an exciting fighter. I mean, he had pretty good leg locks, but after his first 15 fights, he was 2-9-3. So yeah, not really the best start to a career. But in 1999, he managed to surprise everyone when he won the Pancrase Neo Blood Tournament. 4 years on from that, though, he wasn't necessarily doing that much better. Now with a record of 12-17-8, he was still competing in Pancrase, but after picking up a rolling knee bar in Brazil, he got a call from Pride to take part in their 2003 end-of-year show. And who did they give him in his debut? Yeah, none other than Quinton Rampage Jackson. Now, this wasn't early days Rampage. He was coming off a loss to Vanderlei in the 2003 tournament finals. That had been his first loss in 7 fights, so obviously Pride wanted to give him an easy bounce-back opponent, and that's exactly what they did. Rampage absolutely smashed Minowa Man, and after that, they only bloody gave him Vanderlei Silva as well. This time it was over in 60 seconds, before just 1 month later, he was in there against Ryan Gracie, the freaking bad boy of jiu-jitsu. Honestly, I think they may have been trying to kill him. Minowa Man was now in Pride, and it wasn't those fights that made him a fan favourite. He was just the fall guy. Now he started taking on opponents that massively outsized him in freak show fights, and most of the time he actually won, but it was his willingness to get in there with literally anyone that made him a fan favourite, even if he did have to get a complete battering by 3 of the scariest men in the world to do it.
Well, this was an interesting look at MMA history, wasn't it? I know, there's some people on here that you thought probably should have been, but remember guys, it's the fall guys, alright? The guys that had no chance of winning. Someone else who's not really a fall guy, but I heard he does pull guard a lot. It's Max Randall. He bloody edited this video, so go follow him on social media, give him some love at Max Randall. You can check out his new YouTube channel as well. If you're one of our MMA On Point channel champions, thank you very much for supporting the content each and every week. We appreciate you. You can join them. Tons of cool stuff to get stuck into. Click the button down below, or or check the description. If you enjoyed the video, guys, give us a thumbs up, always very much appreciated. And if you want to see more from us, hit subscribe, you'll get notified and you can join the fam. All right, guys, I'm going to go watch some Diego Lopez highlights before we add them to this list. I'll see you next time. Take it easy.